Before we start into Entity Framework, let's talk about Link to SQL, because Microsoft has another mapping technology available. Link to SQL generally functions as a model in the same way as Entity Framework. But there are two big differences between the technologies. The first is that, as you might expect from the name, Link to SQL is specific to SQL Server, while Entity Framework is usable with any back-end data store. The other difference is that Link to SQL provides a one-to-one object-to-table mapping, while Entity Framework lets you create objects that may span several tables. And actually, there's really a third difference. Even though Link to SQL is relatively lightweight and has some nice features specific to SQL Server, Microsoft is not going to continue to enhance Link to SQL going forward. In other words, the technology is probably going to stagnate. They will continue to include Link to SQL as part of the .NET Framework in its current form, and it may get an occasional bug fix, but it probably isn't a good choice to use an abandoned technology in new applications. Microsoft is clearly positioning Entity Framework as the object relational mapping technology of choice. So for new applications, it's probably best to consider using Entity Framework. All right, so let's talk about Entity Framework as an MVC model. Entity Framework is almost ideally suited to be a model in an MVC application. It provides all of the properties you need to access fields of data, as well as many methods you can use to create, retrieve, update, and delete the data, the classic CRUD set of database operations. What we're going to do now is create an Entity Framework model that uses the product table of the AdventureWorks LT 2008 database in SQL Server. That's one of the sample databases that Microsoft makes available. And then, once we have the model, we'll take a look at how we can use it within an MVC application. I'll go ahead and create a new project. I'm going to use the ASP.NET MVC2 web application, and I'm going to name it the AWLT Products project because I'm going to use the products table of the AdventureWorks database. Click on OK. In this case, I don't want to create a unit test project, so I'll select that radio button and click on OK. And Visual Studio takes a moment or two and creates a brand new project. Next thing I want to do is create the Entity Framework model. So I'll go over here to Solution Explorer, right-click on Models, select Add, and New Item. In this case, I want to use the data set of templates, and I want to create an ADO.NET Entity Data Model. I'm going to give it the name of AWLT and add that to the project. And that starts the Entity Data Model wizard. I have various options in creating this model. I can generate it from a database, or I can create an empty model that I can use in order to create a model and then later generate a database from it. But in this case, I want to use the AdventureWorks database, so I'll select Generate from Database. And then I can select the connection that I want to use to connect to the database. As you can see, I don't currently have any connections, so I'll have to create a new connection. In this case, I'm going against SQL Server, and I'm going to use the local machine. I'll use Windows Authentication, but I can enter the SQL Server authentication credentials if I needed to. And then I want to select the AdventureWorks database, and specifically the AdventureWorks LT 2008 version of the database. Then I can test the connection, and it succeeded. Everything looks fine, and I'll click on OK. And so now we have a connection to that database. And here you can see the entity connection string. Now, if you used the connection strings with ADO.NET, that connection string is here. But the Entity Framework actually uses a little bit more metadata information. So that's why the full metadata string for this entity framework connection is a little bit longer. And then you have the option of saving the entity connection settings in web.config, and you can name them. And it gives you a default name. I'm going to change that default to just AWLT entities, because I'm going to use that name within the application. Here's a place where this is a little bit misleading. It says save entity connection settings in web.config as. But not only does this item control the name of the connection string in web.config, it's also going to be the name of the class that's derived from object context that we'll use in the code as the entree into the model. So the default value of AdventureWorks LT 2008 entities is a bit unwieldy to keep typing over and over again in code. So usually you want to rename this to something a little bit shorter. Still meaningful, but something shorter. Click on Next, and it goes out and looks at the database to see what objects are available. So I have the option of selecting various tables and views and stored procedures. As you can see, it's read all of those objects from the database. But in this case, all I want is the product table, which is part of the Sales LT schema. I have some options for pluralizing and singularizing generated object names, and I can include foreign key columns in the model. I'll accept those defaults. And once again, I'll also shorten this name, because I'll use that in time in code, and it's the AdventureWorks LT model, AWLT. And I'll click on Finish. Once Visual Studio finishes creating the entity framework model, it opens the designer, as you can see. Here you can view the objects that are now contained within the model. And I'll get the output window out of the way. Here's where you can see all of the fields within the database. At this point, it's a one-to-one mapping between the product entity and the product table within the database. You can change that, but we're going to keep things fairly simple here. You can also look at the mapping details by right-clicking on the designer and selecting Mapping Details here, and then select an entity, and here you can see how this object is mapped to the underlying database. So you can see that it maps to the product table and then the various column mappings. And you can change this information, such as by renaming the fields or making various other kinds of changes to make it appropriate for your use in the application. I'm going to leave all the default mappings. Then I'll go over to Solution Explorer and open up this designer file. This is the code that the Entity Framework Wizard generated for the AWLT products.models namespace, as you can see here. And you can explore all of the code that the wizard created as a result of generating that entity model. One very important step now is to build the project. So I'll go ahead and do that. And it's successfully built, always a good thing. That's an important step because later on, when you start using MVC in order to use this entity framework model as a model for the application, it's going to look at the compiled assembly, not the code here within this designer.cs file, but the compiled assembly. So it needs that compiled assembly, otherwise it can't populate the various dialog boxes that it needs to. All right, so the model that we just created now has a rich product class that wraps the data in the corresponding table in the AdventureWorks database. We can modify the model in the designer as we need to make it more usable within our application. A very common kind of change that you might consider doing is to rename tables, which are called entities in Entity Framework, as well as fields and other objects, to use a different naming standard for the objects in your application than what's used in the database. This is an object relational mapping technology, and so you have control over how the product model is created and how you use it within your application. And then an entity framework takes care of all of the mapping details to get the data to and from the database table where it belongs. But in this case, I'm just going to use the model as is. But just keep in mind there's lots of ways of customizing it. One caution though, you should never ever change the code here directly within this designer file. The reason is that if you ever make changes to this data model here using the designer, it's going to regenerate this designer code and any of your changes will be lost. But you can implement changes because these classes are implemented as partial classes. So you can create other partial classes named the same thing in order to add different features. And that's a very important technique when you look at data validation using an entity framework model. Now it's time to put the model to use. What we're going to do now is create a product controller with action methods that perform various operations on the product model and display various views. We're not going to implement a complete application here, but we'll do enough so that you can see how easy it is to use an entity framework model within an MVC application. What we're going to do now is generate a list of products in the index view of a product controller. We'll create both the controller and view using the features in MVC and Visual Studio to perform most of the hard work. So I'll come over here to Solution Explorer and right-click on Controllers and select Add and Controller. And notice that the pop-up menu has a controller item because I right-clicked on that folder. I'm going to name this controller Product Controller. And I'm going to select this checkbox that says Add Action Methods for Create, Update, Delete, and Details Scenarios. So this is going to cause Visual Studio and MVC to create a number of stub action methods for us. So that'll save a lot of the work of creating those action methods. And I'll click on the Add button. So as you can see, right out of the gate, we have a fair amount of code that has already been created with some helpful comments about the format of what the URL is going to be for each of these. Now, in order to simplify writing code that uses the model, I'm going to add a reference up here within the Using section to the AWLT products.models namespace. We're going to be referencing objects within that namespace over and over again, so that'll save a few keystrokes. All right, we want to implement our list within the index action method. So this is the default method of this controller. What we need to do is instantiate the model's object context. There are a number of ways of doing this, but here what we're going to do is instantiate an AWLT entities object context object created in the entity framework model, wrapping the code in a using block to let .NET handle disposing of it efficiently. Then we'll use that object in order to reference the products collection and use the toList method of the collection to create a generic collection of product objects that the view is going to use in order to display the data in a list. In order to keep the size of the list manageable, we'll use the link where method and return only the products with names that start with W. In a real application, you could implement paging or use other techniques in order to limit the size of the list. So let's go ahead and implement that code. And I'll new up an AWLT entities object. And then we can use that DB object in order to return a view that provides that collection of objects. So we'll use return, call the view method, and use the products collection and the where method. Use a lambda expression to send P into the p.name.startsWith and pass in a W to that method. And then convert that to a list. All right, so that's all we need to do because a lot of the functionality for retrieving that data from the database is contained within the entity framework model. A note about creating this DB object here, which is the AWLT entities object. You might be tempted to create that in a class-level field in order to hold a reference to the AWLT entities object, and either immediately instantiate it or use a constructor in order to instantiate it. That really wouldn't be entirely bad, but a better practice is to instantiate it in each action method where you use the model, wrapping it in a using block like I've done here. Keep in mind that this is a web application, so you don't really need a class-level reference, and it's always better to keep the life of data objects as short as possible. Besides, you may not need to use the model in every action method, so your code will be more efficient by instantiating it at the method level. All right, the next step is to create the view. There's an easy way in an MVC application to do most of the work of creating a view. All I need to do is right-click within an action method and select Add View from the pop-up menu. And that opens up the Add View dialog box. In this case, I'm going to leave the view name as the default index because I want it to match up with the name of the action method. That just keeps my code nice and simple. I don't have to provide anything to this view method to indicate a different view name. I want to create a strongly typed view because I want to use that AWLT entities product object right there. And now the view is going to be bound to that product object. I want to create a list view, so I'm going to select that kind of content. But notice that it'll automatically create a view that has the code to create, delete, display the details, and edit a product as well. I want the page to fit into the overall scheme and appearance of the website, so I'm going to keep this Select Master Page selected, and that's the only master page within the application. And it picked up that the main content holder within site.master is main content. All right, so I'll click the Add button, and it creates this nice view and displays it within the designer. So a couple things to notice about this page. First of all, notice that it once again inherits from view page and is bound to that collection, that IEnumerable object of product objects. And then within this main content area, it defines a table structure. So here are the headers for that list. And then it implements a for each loop in order to loop through that collection of product objects, as you can see. And it's going to assign with each iteration of the loop one of those products to this item variable. Then it loops through and reads the data from each of those properties in order to display it within that table. So as you can see, the ability to right-click the action method in order to create a view is a great time saver. You may want to change this code and update it and reformat it, do whatever you need to do, but it does a lot of the work for you. I do need to point out that the ability to right-click on an action method is not something that is specific to Entity Framework. It's available no matter how you implemented the model. So in fact, you can use it with the simple custom dog model that we saw a little bit earlier. All right, so now the product table includes a lot of fields, which we really don't need to display within a list. This is going to be an awfully wide table on that index view. So let's cut it down a bit. We only want to include the product ID, name, product number, and list price fields. So let's go ahead and change that. So we want the product ID, name, product number. We don't want the color. Let's get rid of that. Don't want the standard cost. We do want the list price. And we want to get rid of the rest of the fields. All right, there's the headers, and now we need to do the same thing for each of the rows. So we want the product ID, name, product number, but not the color, not the standard cost. Leave the list price in, and get rid of the rest of the fields. And I'll hit Control-S to save the work. All right, so now the list will be much more manageable on the page and give the user meaningful information to select a particular product. The next thing we want to do is make it easy to get to the view. So we'll add a link to the Home Controller's index page. So we'll go over here, go to the Home Controller and the index page. And what I'll do is I'll get rid of this generic ASP.NET text within that paragraph tag. and add a code nugget. It'll use an HTML helper method called ActionLink. And to that, I'll pass the text that I want to appear in the page, so I'll make that product list. I want to call the index action method of the product controller. And that'll do the right thing and create the correct link in order to link into and call that index method. All right, I'll save that and run the application. There's our product list that we just added, and I'll click on it. And that goes to the product controller and, by default, the index method. And here's our list of products that start with W. And as you can see, it automatically added links to edit, view the details, and delete the various products. None of those are implemented yet because we haven't done anything with the action methods. There are some things that we can do in order to enhance the appearance of this list. For example, notice that the product ID name is all run together, as is product number, and the list price isn't formatted very well. So let's make a change in order to format that list price. So I'll go back to the index view here and down to the list price. So the first thing I want to do is align the data to the right, so I'll add an align attribute to that TD element. Okay, so now it'll be right aligned. And I want to change the format here to currency. So I'll change it from F to C. So keep in mind that what the view should do is stick to user interface code. These are valid changes to do within a view because it affects how the data is displayed to the user. It doesn't change the data, it doesn't update the data, it doesn't apply any kind of business rules whatsoever, unless you happen to have a business rule that says all list prices should be formatted as currency. But that's a user interface kind of business rule. So this is the appropriate place to make these kinds of changes. That way, the data that comes from the model can remain in its generic format, and then it's formatted for the view, whatever is appropriate. All right, so I'll run the application again and go over to the product list. And notice now that the list prices are nicely formatted and right aligned. So as you can see, it's really pretty easy to use an entity framework model in an MVC application. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add the ability to edit those products and see a little bit more about how the entity framework model works within an MVC application. All right, let's go back over to the product controller. When I created the controller, Visual Studio and MVC added these edit methods. So all we need to do is flesh out the code here, because we do have a little bit of work to do. In this first version of the method that handles the get verb, we need to display a form, but we need to populate it with the data from a product. And then in the second method, we need to then take that data that comes from the form and update the data and save it to the underlying database. All right, so first thing we'll do is modify this edit method. What we have to do here is first of all grab a reference to the selected product in the model's product entity and then send it to the view. And we'll do that using the ID parameter that is passed into the method. So let's go ahead and implement that. So I once again need to use that AWLT entities object. And new up an object there. All right, now I'm going to create a product object and use link in order to access the selected product. So that equal to db.products. And I'll use the single link method in order to grab a reference to a single instance of the product object. And in order to do that, I'll use a lambda expression to send P into p.productID, where that's equal to the ID parameter. All right, so now product holds a reference to the selected product, and we just now need to return a view result to display the data. So I'll use return and use the view helper method and pass in that product. And recall that what this is going to do is this is going to assign that product to the model property of the view data object that the view can then access. Now make sure that you use the appropriate link method here to select the product. Single returns a single product object every single time. But you might be tempted to use the where method instead. But this won't work, even if there's only a single product with matching product ID, because where returns a collection. The view is going to expect a single object, not a collection. But on the other hand, if you really want to do a little bit more work, you could use where, but then you'd have to, here within the action method, extract just the single instance of product. But that's extra work for no additional benefit. So generally it's better to use the appropriate method, here the single method. All right, I need to create the view, so I'll right-click here within the edit method. And it really doesn't matter which edit method I right-click in, even though I haven't made any changes to the code here. And I'll select Add View. I'm going to accept the default view name, again, because it matches the action method name. Notice that it pre-populated this create a strongly typed view option as well as the view data class, because those are the selections that I used the last time. But here what I need to do is select the view content to edit the information. And then I'll go ahead and again use the master page and the main content area. All right, so there's our edit view. Notice that it's bound to a single instance of a product. And then Visual Studio and MVC populated all of the fields in order to display all of the data. So let's go ahead and run it. Here's the product list. And now we can click on Edit in order to edit that product. And as you can see, the text boxes are all now populated with data from the database. So we can make changes, but we haven't yet done the work in order to handle the data going back into the controller. So let's do that now. What we need to do within this version of the edit action method is to grab the data and then update the data in memory as well as persist it back to the database. By default, it takes an ID parameter as well as a form collection, and you could use that form collection in order to retrieve the individual values of the fields from the form. But in this case, I'm only going to use the ID parameter, and I could get rid of that or leave it in, whatever I want to do. So what the code is going to need to do is grab the product from the model and then execute the try update model method, which is a method of the controller class, in order to update the product instance that's in memory. This doesn't yet save the data back to the database, but it persists the changes to the in-memory version of that product. And then it's going to check the model state to see if it's valid at this point, which means it's going to check that the user entered no missing or invalid data. And then, if everything is okay at that point, it's going to call the Save Changes method of the Entity Framework model, which then writes the data back to the database. But otherwise, if the model is invalid, it's going to redisplay the form with some messages to the user and give the user the opportunity to correct any problems. So let's go ahead and implement that. I'll get rid of this code. All right, I need to once again do a using block that is going to use the AWLT entities and create a DB object. All right, and that instantiates that. Next, we need to grab a reference to the selected product. So I'll create a product object variable and use the products collection of the DB object, and then again the single method. Do a lambda expression, send that into p.productID, and match up with ID. All right, so now we have a reference to the selected product from the Entity Framework model. Now we need to go ahead and try to update that model using that product object. And then check the model state and make sure that it's valid. If it is valid, we want to call the Entity Framework model's save changes, and that's what persists the data back to the database. And if everything goes well to here, we want to go ahead and redirect to the index view. Otherwise, if the model state is not valid, we want to go ahead and return back to the edit view and just pass in that product object. Now in this code, I'm using the try_update_model method of the controller class. But there's also an update model method. If the user entered any invalid data or didn't enter some required data, then update model is going to throw an invalid operation exception. Try_update model, the other version of the method, normally doesn't throw an exception, but instead sets the model state's isValid property to false. So you can use whichever version of that method that you like. If you want to deal with the exception, use update model. If you want to check the isValid property, use the try_update model. Really doesn't matter which one you use. All right, let's go ahead and run the application. Select product list, and I'll select that item to change. And I'll just do a real simple change here. Add a W to the end of the product name, and save that data back. And as you can see, that change has been made, and it's been persisted back to the database.